Uh, in the previous video, I introduced the basic ideas of reduced form and structural approach. By the way, they are relative terms. So, even though I say the endogeneity problem arises from the structural approach, but in the frontier of the research, like no one thinks our model as a structural model. The real structural model, when you say a structural model to in a seminar, for example, then you have to imagine a very complicated model. Like you assume that utility function takes like Cobb-Douglas form, and the production function takes this form, and there is how the government maximizes things, like solve those problems, and then you get equilibrium like that, and you put data onto that model. This is structural model in the frontier of research and in by researchers. But in this chapter, you are at the very basic level. So I'm comparing the linear projection approach to the regression model versus endogeneity setup. So then they are relatively, the linear projection is reduced form, and endogeneity is more structural problem. So there is no clear definition, but it's just relatively what is more structural and what is less structural. So then, in sum, the reduced form approach is a more descriptive approach. I don't know what's beneath it. Just I will describe the pattern. That is reduced form approach. And structural approach is more like literally structural. More willing to make assumptions and more willing to make more specific, like more assumptions on their relationship, and specify the meanings of each variables and each relationship. So then you may have heard about this problem, causality, or so many people say regression only talks about association or correlation, not about causation. So if you want to say something about the causal relationship, cause and effect relationship, you need to take the structural approach. The linear projection has no power to say talk more about causal inference. So that means you need to make more assumptions to get a stronger conclusion. But on the other hand, more assumptions make your conclusion more vulnerable, because the assumptions could be wrong. And in this chapter, and actually throughout this course, most arguments are based on the structural approach that I described here. So it is structural only in this sense, but as I said, if you use this model in your paper, in your dissertation, then people will think you are a reduced form person. So it's very still very simple setup. So if you are interested in later, if you are interested in like major in econometrics, specialize in econometrics, there are typically different styles of researches. For example, MIT, Harvard econometricians do more reduced form approaches, like Angrist, Imbens. These guys are most famous of them. So they are usually satisfied with simple regression models or a little variation of those regression models. Basically, some kind of regression models. On the other side, researchers at Chicago have they prefer structural models. Like, for example, James Heckman's model. James Heckman has a very serious structural models in his papers. And also, for example, empirical IO or international trade guys and and structural macro researchers also use structural approach. Like international trade, we assume what is the trade cost, what is the production function, what is the demand function, and we estimate those models with data. And in empirical IO also we define what's the demand in the market, how the firms determine their prices, like that. So, as I said, what we do takes this approach. We are putting meanings on each variables, but so I'm going to call this structural, but it's not that structural relative to the real structural models. And okay, so that's just so those distinction is important, but does not matter actually for a while. It's just conceptual background. I'm going to talk about examples of endogeneity. So endogeneity, so we are going to, before defining what is the endogeneity problem, I will give you several examples where the endogeneity problem is naturally arises. So and as I said, all the variables has its own meaning. So keep that in mind. We are not just approximating the left-hand side variable using the right-hand side variable. The first example is the omitted variables approach. Suppose that wage is determined by education and intelligence and errors, or like say accounting errors or measurement errors. So here, the key problem here is intelligence is not observed. We cannot measure intelligence at all. So the only thing we observe here is the wage and the education. So then we cannot do anything more than this because we don't observe more than wage and education. In this case, epsilon, that you may interpret epsilon as this guy. Epsilon includes all of this part. The problem here is if your estimated gamma equals beta 1, then there is no problem. Then your regression model is still useful. However, the problem here is they are not the same. If you ignore intelligence and if you include intelligence into the error term, then the problem here is education and intelligence must be correlated. So intelligence inside epsilon must be correlated with education. So epsilon will be correlated with education. So this assumption, the exogeneity assumption, fails. This is maybe most common way to interpret, to motivate the endogeneity problem. Second example, non-random sampling, or usually it's referred to as the sample selection or selection problem, censoring or missing data. Again, we are going to study wage, but what we would like to study here is the effect of immigrant status on wage. So, for example, I'm from Korea, and I'm from South Korea, and I would like to estimate how much I would earn, what would be my salary if I was not a South Korea, if I was a native US citizen, for example. Then basically you are trying to estimate beta 1. I'm an immigrant, but what if I was not an immigrant? So I would like to estimate beta 1. But of course, anyone will expect, if I were a US citizen, I would expect higher wage. But in the 1970s or 1980s, some labor economists studied this problem. At that time, it was an important problem. But surprisingly, the result is the other way. Immigrants made more money than natives. Can you believe? Of course, it's something is wrong. So immigrants earn more money than natives. The problem is later on, people find that that's because of the sample selection. That means I'm an immigrant and I'm still in the United States because I survived. I survived. I could find a job, but I know a lot of friends of mine who, for many different reasons, went back to South Korea. So, main reason, one of the important reasons for them to go back is basically their salary or their job opportunities. So, rather than taking low salary here, if I go back to South Korea, then I may get better salary or better living environment. So in that sense, your observations is only for successfully survived immigrants. So, but it's unfair. If I were a U.S. citizen, then I would stay here no matter what salary I could get. I have no option to move outside, for example. That's the selection. Your observation is not random. You are observing like some successful guys or some like lower end guys. So these kind of non-random sampling causes problem, and this happens a lot. Similar examples, for example, effect of smoking. It's famous. So medical researchers studied some people who quit smoking after at least 10 years of smoking history. What they find is after they quit their smoking, they died very quickly. Their life expectancy was very low. But and then it seems like quitting smoking is more dangerous. Quitting, if you have smoked for 10 years, then you have to continue to smoke. That's a little bit weird, but the reason why people quit smoking is because they are so sick, so they could not afford any more cigarette at all. So like if I have a cancer right now, then I cannot smoke at all. That's why they quit the smoking, and that's the only sample you could find. Otherwise, who would quit smoking after 10 years? So that's sample selection. Another sample selection, married woman's wage. If you'd like to study the effect of married woman's wage, the problem is those who work, the married women who work, are usually from a lower income family. So if my wife was a billionaire, then I would quit my job as soon as I marry her, right? So the observed working women are actually a little bit biased. So in those examples, the endogeneity problem causes a big problem. So we need to learn. Okay, I'm going to continue two more. I'm going to give you two more examples in the next video.